You're watching Study with Sudhir. This is your digital classroom. My name is T.S. Sudhir. We are looking at the Sound Machine, which is a story written by Roald Dahl, and this is part of the ISC English Literature syllabus for class 12. Okay, now let's first read about the author. Now, Roald Dahl was a British novelist, poet, short story writer, screenwriter, and fighter pilot. Now, this particular story is slightly frightening and one dare say a bit of a weird kind of a story, and it also shows the meaning of scientific discovery, inventions, and about how people exploit vegetation, the flora and fauna, for their own selfish ends, and while ignoring the emotions that many of these living organisms would have, right? The protagonist is called Klausner, and then there is also his doctor, Dr. Scott, and their neighbors, Mrs. Saunders. So basically only three characters through which this story proceeds. We will be doing this particular story explanation in two videos. Now, before I get into the story, I want to talk to you about what is really the mood of the story. And the mood of the story almost throughout is a sense of foreboding. Now, what do I mean by foreboding? Foreboding essentially means that you get that feeling something wrong is going to happen, something undesirable is going to happen. You sometimes get that kind of a feeling, right? You know, it's almost like kuch galat hone wala hai. You know, you get that kind of a vibe. It is that kind of a mood as far as the story is concerned. The protagonist Klausner has some kind of a very nervous energy because he's very excited about the invention he has made, right? And that's where his entire dedication and singular focus is. You know, he's focused on that particular invention. Then the larger theme of this particular story is the theme of sound, and that's something which you need to be very aware of. There is a theme of sound, and I'll keep pointing out instances from the story which talk about the theme of sound. There is also the reference to the coffin of a child, again something which adds to the sense of foreboding. So these are important points that you need to take care of. Okay, so now let's start with the story. The story was first published in the New Yorker, which is a very popular publication, in 1949, and thereafter it also appeared in many other publications. Now, it was a warm summer evening, and Klausner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed, and he unlocked the door, went inside and closed the door behind him. So right at the outside, in the first paragraph, you get an idea about something which is a little secretive. It is not in the main part of the house, it's the back side of the house. So something which is hidden from public view, right? So there is that element of mystery that Roald Dahl has introduced right in the first paragraph of this story. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. So you see a bit of the roughness that Roald Dahl is actually telling you about. Unpainted means, you know, something which is not a finished product. Against one wall on the left, there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires, littering means lots of wires all jumbled up together, and batteries and small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, right? The shape of a child's coffin. Now, this is important, the reference to that black box, that it resembled a child's coffin. Now, it is kind of giving you a sense that something associated with death is about to follow. Okay, it's giving you a hint. Okay, otherwise why would you refer to a black box? A black box could have been described as just another black box, as a trunk or an unfinished product, whatever. To call it a child's coffin is deliberate on part of the author. Klausner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box, and started running his fingers along the wires. So giving you a very vivid description of what he's doing. You can almost imagine him, you know, peering into the box and doing a whole lot of stuff jumbled amidst the jumbled up wires. So he did this almost for an hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box where there were 3 dials like in a clock, and he began to twiddle them, that is play with them, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. Now if you are familiar with kind of inventions or any kind of repair work that may be happening at your home, you would understand the mechanism. Suppose you have the old grandpa kind of clock. If you open it up, when you move the dial, you would see the inside of the machine actually also moving. So it's all linked. So that's what is being described out here. All the while, he kept speaking softly to himself, nodding his head, smiling sometimes, his hands always moving, the fingers moving swiftly, deftly inside the box, his mouth twisting into curious shapes when a thing was delicate and difficult to do. When you're trying to, very delicately use the screwdriver, right? Or do something very delicately, your facial expressions also change. Sometimes you pucker your lips like this, right? When you are concentrating, focusing on the task at hand. And he's also smiling to himself because he's also proud of what he had done. Some bit he was feeling pleased about, something which had worked out pretty well. Yes, and now this one. Yes, but is this right? Is it? Where is my diagram? So he's, a mind which is obsessed with what he's doing. Extremely focused, very, very concentrated on the job at hand. Ah, yes, of course. Yes, that's right. And now, good, talking to himself. His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. Please underline these phrases. You can use this in a character analysis of Klausner. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, of breathlessness, of strong, suppressed excitement. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. So that's the mood which has been established. There is a mystery. There is also a sense of excitement, right? So now we know this much about the story, right? That something is there about the black box. But that also resembles a child's coffin. Suddenly, he heard footsteps on the gravel path. Gravel means kacha path kind of thing. Outside, and he straightened and turned swiftly as the door opened and a tall man came in. It was Scott. It was only Scott, the doctor. Now, only Scott is important because it doesn't think of the doctor as some kind of a threat to whatever activity he's undertaking inside that shed, mysteriously hid behind the main part of the house. You also wonder when he says it's only Scott whether he was expecting someone else at that point in time. Well, the doctor said, so this is where you hide yourself in the evenings. Hide, another important word. Please mark it. Hello Scott, I happened to be passing, the doctor told him, so I dropped in to see how you were. So there is a sense of comfort that Klausner has vis-a-vis this doctor, okay. Though later on we see that he's not very forthcoming about all the queries that he's asking about his health. There is no one in the house, so I came on down here. How is that throat of yours been behaving? Throat, important because it's also linked to the theme of sound, which I have said is the major theme of this particular story, this sound machine. The sound itself is there in the title of the story. It's all right, it's fine. He doesn't want to continue the conversation. Now I'm here, I might as well have a look at it. Please don't trouble, I'm quite cured, I'm fine. So he's being a little rough, being a bit brusque, impatient with the doctor. He doesn't want him to kind of examine him at that point in time. The doctor began to feel the tension in the room. He looked at the black box on the bench, then he looked at the man. You've got your hat on. That is, even while he's working inside the shed, obviously he doesn't need to wear his hat, but he's wearing his hat, which shows a slightly absent-minded temperament. Oh, have I? Klausner reached up, removed the hat and put it on the bench. The doctor came up closer and bent down to look into the box. What is this? He said, making a radio, because that's what it looks like with all those wires and the dials. No, just fooling around. He doesn't want to reveal what he's doing. It has got rather complicated looking innards. Innards means the interior, It's almost like inside of a human body. See, because it obviously shows that Klausner is not too happy with his intrusion by the doctor. Though he doesn't think of him as any kind of threat. What is it? It's a rather frightening looking thing. Please mark it. That's the first impression of an outsider, that he describes it as a frightening looking thing. Again, a sense of foreboding as to what could possibly unfold in the later part of the story. It's just an idea. Yes, it has got It's to do with sound, that's all. Good heavens, man, don't you get enough of that sort of thing all day in your work? Which means that he's already engaged in work where he deals with that. So this is something extracurricular or something away from his office work that he seems to be doing. I like sound. So it seems the doctor went to the door, turned and said, well, I won't disturb you. Glad your throat is not worrying you anymore. But he kept standing there. The doctor is saying, I'll go, but he doesn't go, right? Because he's curious, what is this machine all about? He said it's about sound. It looks like a radio, but he wants to know what that machine all about. Intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside. Remarkable complexity of its inside. Please mark it. Curious to know what this strange patient of his, strange patient, character analysis of Klausner, please use this phrase, was up to. What is it really for? You have made me inquisitive. So he's obviously curious, because he's also curious because of Klausner's strange kind of reaction, as also what he's seeing the box before him. Klausner looked down at the box, then at the doctor, and he reached and began gently to scratch the lobe of his right ear. So he's scratching the lobe of his right ear. There was a pause. The doctor stood by the door, smiling, waiting, smiling. All right, I'll tell you if you're interested. And then he said, because, he is obviously a little pleased with the invention he has made. So he does want to share about it, just like we are. We have written a good essay. We want someone in our family to read it, right? And just give a reaction. Or if you compose music, you have done something, you want someone in your family or your friends to listen to it and give a feedback of sort. So that's what Klausner is getting tempted to do right now, because the doctor has evinced interest in the machine. He was shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the lobe of his ear, looking at his feet, and then at last slowly he said, he's deliberating, he's thinking, should I not? Well, it's like this. The theory is very simple really. The human ear, you know that it can't hear everything. We know that, right? There are sounds that are so low pitched or so high pitched that it can't hear them, because the ear hears sound only in a particular range. Okay. Now, right now, I'm hearing my own voice while I'm recording this. I may not be able to hear the sound of some insects, some ants which may be going past. Does it mean that the ants do not talk? Does it mean that the ants do not speak to each other? They would be, but their frequency, the pitch at which they talk would either be high or low, that the human ear cannot register that sound. Well, speaking roughly, any note so high that it has more than 15,000 vibrations a second, we can't hear it. Dogs have better ears than us, right? Which is why dogs are used as guards. You can buy a whistle whose note is so high pitched that you can't hear it at all, but a dog can hear it. Okay, so a dog is able to hear it, which a human ear cannot. Yes, I have seen it. Okay. Of course you have, and up the scale, higher than the note of that whistle, there is another note, a vibration if you like, but I prefer to think of it as a note. Now please understand that he's talking about sound as a note, almost like a musical note. He's not thinking of it as sound as in the roughness of sound. He's thinking of it almost as if it has a musical quality to it. You can't hear that one either, and above that there is another rising right up the scale for ever and ever and ever. An endless succession of notes. Again, he uses the word note. An infinity of notes. There is a note, if only our ears could hear it, so high that it vibrates 1,000,000 times a second, and another 1,000,000 times as high as that, and on, higher and higher as far as numbers go, which is infinity, eternity, beyond the stars. So it's almost like a musical opera. He's describing the infinity of sound, and he describes it as the infinity of notes. Okay. Now, the doctor obviously has become curious, which is why Klausner decides to show it to him. And as I said, he speaks about it more like a poetic and a musical note than just a vibration, right? Now, it kind of prepares us for what is to unfold, because later on he will be dealing with vegetation, right? Which also has a delicate quality to it, right? flora and fauna, flowers and leaves, etc., have some kind of a delicate quality about them. So that is what Klausner is kind of able to relate to, that feeling of being very, very delicate. And that's what, and also the story is in a sense exploring the territory of the unknown, because what Klausner is actually describing to Dr. Scott is an unknown territory. It is not a territory which the human ear is familiar with, right? So what happens when you kind of venture into the unknown? It's almost like a horror story of sorts. And what kind of sounds we could be in, what could lie in store for us later on in the story. Now, Klausner was getting very animated as he was talking, right? Because he's very excited about this invention that he has made. He was a small, frail man as compared to Dr. Scott, who was a tall person, nervous and twitchy. Twitchy is somebody who is, has a nervous energy, and his twitches, his various, eyes or ears, whatever, mouth, while he's talking, with always moving hands, a bit like me. His large head inclined toward his left shoulder as though his neck was not quite strong enough to support it rigidly. His face was smooth and pale, almost white, and the pale grey eyes that blinked and peered from behind a pair of steel spectacles were bewildered, unfocused, remote. Please, this paragraph is very important when you're talking about the description of Klausner. He was a frail, nervous, twitchy little man, a moth of a man. He's using the same words again. Dreamy and distracted, suddenly fluttering and animated. And now the doctor, looking at that strange pale face and those pale grey eyes, felt that somehow there was about this little person a quality of distance, of immense, immeasurable distance, as though the mind were far away from where his body was. He's there, but his mind is actually racing. He's talking, his mind is actually talking about things which may be a little incomprehensible, that is, cannot be easily understood by someone else. So he felt as though his mind and body are actually in two different spheres. In fact, I wouldn't name the particular actor turned politician, but I always felt that this particular actor turned politician from South India, when he spoke, he would never finish a sentence. When you would interview him, he would never finish his sentence. By the time he reached to the second last or the third last word of what that sentence should be, he would jump to the next sentence. And I always felt that this man's mind is actually thinking ahead of his tongue. That his mind is going into the next sentence and without finishing the sentence that he's speaking in the interview. And I found this a very strange and a very remarkable quality. Now, people may find, when you're doing that in a speech, people may find him incomprehensible, that he's not making sense. But, that's a disconnect between the body and your tongue when you're speaking. In this case, between the body and the mind, that he felt that there was a quality of distance. He could see the person before him, that is Klausner, but his mind seemed to be elsewhere. His mind seemed to be in a totally different kind of a sphere, in a different kind of a world. The doctor waited for him to go on. Klausner sighed and clasped his hands tightly together. I believe that there is a whole world of sound about us all the time that we cannot hear. It's possible that up there in those high-pitched, inaudible regions, there is a new exciting music being made that we do not know. Our ears are incapable of hearing that kind of sound, with subtle harmonies and fierce grinding discord. So that music could have both. It could be musical, it could be very discordant kind of notes as well, but they are so powerful that it would drive us mad that if our ears were actually tuned to listening to the sound of it. There may be anything for all we know, and it just goes on, but it's not very probable. Why not? Why not? And he says, do you see that fly, the house fly? What sort of a noise that fly is making now? Just like I gave the example of an ant a while ago. None that one can hear. For all we know that the creature may be whistling like mad on a very high note, or barking or croaking or singing a song. It has got a mouth, hasn't it? It has got a throat. So he's saying that that housefly actually may be singing. Have you seen the movie by S.S. Rajamouli, Iga in Telugu, Makhi in Hindi, where the actor Nani gets killed and he takes a rebirth as a housefly and takes revenge on Sudhir, who has killed him, right? Have you seen? It's a fantastic movie, very entertaining movie. That's what, where they see the housefly also singing and, Eega, 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 that song, okay, in Telugu. So, the housefly could sing. So that's what the imagination is, that humanizing a housefly. Here, Klausner is also humanizing the fly, that for all you know, even though we can't hear, it doesn't mean that that housefly is dumb. For all you know, it could be singing a song or croaking or shouting loudly or barking. Okay. The doctor looked at the fly and he smiled. He was still standing by the door. Well, he said, so you're going to check up on that? So it's almost like mocking. He's not very amused by this slightly crazy kind of talk. Some time ago, I made a simple instrument that proved to me the existence of many odd, inaudible sounds. Often I have sat and watched the needle of my instrument recording the presence of sound vibrations in the air when I myself could hear nothing. And those are the sounds I want to listen to. I want to know where they come from. So he's interested in sound. He wants to understand. So he's a sound scientist in a sense. He wants to understand the origin of those sounds and who is making them, what is making them, and what do they sound like. And that machine on the table is going to allow you, right? So you see, the doctor is a little bit of has a bit of a mocking kind of a tone, He's a regular physician, right? Strangely doesn't have much of a patience for this kind of what he thinks as a slightly crazy kind of an experiment. He says, yeah, so far I've not had any luck. The machine is designed to pick up sound vibrations that are too high pitched for reception by the human ear and to convert them into a scale of audible tones. I tune it in almost like a radio. How do you mean? It isn't complicated. Say I wish to listen to the squeak of a bat. That's a fairly high-pitched sound. So you realize that this man has actually done a whole lot of research. He's able to explain what he intends to do with that particular machine. About 30,000 vibrations a second. The average human ear can't quite hear it. Now, if there were a bat flying around this room and I tuned into 30,000 on my machine, it would hear the squeaking of that bat very clearly. I would even hear the correct note, F sharp or B flat, technical terms, but merely at a much lower pitch. Don't you understand? So doctor says, you're going to try it tonight. Well, I wish you luck. And he says, goodbye, I need to go. Now, after the doctor had gone, Klausner fussed about the wires in the black box and he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said, now we will try again. We'll take you out to the garden this time and then perhaps the reception will be better in the outside area, not inside that room. And then he lifted the box, found it quite heavy and took it to the garden. Okay, and he plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machines and put the earphones for him to be able to hear those sounds, low pitched or high pitched, right? He stood there in the garden. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement because he wants to convince himself that what he's doing is something very remarkable. Okay, he was also afraid that the machine might not work. So he needs to keep on encouraging himself and perhaps also talking to the machine at the same time. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small and thin that he looked like an ancient consumptive bespectacled child, someone who is, obsessed with his project work. The sun had gone down, there was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see a low fence into the little garden, next garden, his neighbor's garden. And there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put out his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, and then when he was bending over the machine, the needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly that he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint spasmodic crackling, right? Now this is almost hinting at fear. It's also spasmodic, you get spasms, you kind of, when you're short of breath and that kind of a feeling. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself. But that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation. He was hearing some other sound as well, right? A feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle. So, you see the very vivid description that Roald Dahl has given as to the kind of effect that strange low-pitched sound was having on his head. That the wires were lengthening, almost as if the sound was reaching out to him or forcing him to reach out to that particular sound, right? As if it was a secret and forbidden territory. Forbidden territory, an important phrase, please mark it. A dangerous ultrasonic region, because it's not in the usual range of sound that the human ear can pick up. It's in the ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be, right? So that was that is forbidden territory. That was not territory that was known to mankind. The little needle crept slowly across the dial and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. So he's shocked at that sound. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. He thought it was some person who had shrieked. There was no one inside except that lady in the neighborhood, in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in the basket. Okay. Again, it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and sound, very clear and cold. Please mark these phrases to describe the kind of sound that he was hearing the first time as a result of the sound machine. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. Now that's a little strange because of what we will know where the sound is actually coming from. Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. He saw her snip the stem of the rose with a pair of scissors, and again he heard the sound. Now it's a little strange that when she's cutting the rose, he's hearing a metallic sound. It could possibly be because of the scissors, right? He is hearing this sharp, piercing, metallic sound. And it came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. And then he reaches out to Mrs. Saunders and he says, you know, can you cut one more quickly? And she says, fine. And she's a little foxed as to why he's saying so, because she's staring at him. And she always thought that her neighbor, that is Klausner, was a bit of a peculiar kind of a person. But now it seemed that he had gone completely mad. He was behaving in a rather crazy kind of manner. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. She said, okay, let me just humor him, let me just do what he says. And she took her scissors from the basket and snipped another rose. And again, Klausner heard the same frightful, throatless shriek. Please mark it, frightful, throatless shriek, because the rose stem doesn't have a throat, okay, but there is a shriek coming out at the same time. He says, that's enough, no more, no more. I'm going to tell you something, he says, and this is something which you will not believe. So he's aware of the fact that people are not going to believe what he's saying. He's completely aware of that. So in that sense, he's not a crazy kind of a person. He's completely aware of what he's doing. There are many critics who have kind of described Klausner as someone, who just goes about the place. But I found my own analysis is that Klausner is completely aware of where he stands, in the sense he knows that what he's doing is not something which will be believed easily by people, right? But he's convinced that what he's doing is something of value. At least that's what he believes, right? All scientists are a little crazy, right? You need that kind of a craze in order to be able to venture into things unknown. Otherwise, we'll never would have made any inventions or any discoveries, right? You have this evening cut a basket full of roses. You have with a sharp pair of scissors cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders? No, I certainly did not know that. So he says, I heard them shrieking every time you cut one, a high-pitched sound, approximately 1,032,000 vibrations a second. So he's being very precise. So his machine is kind of working. you couldn't have possibly heard it. So he said, did you really? And she said, I'm going to, because she thinks he's mad fellow. And she always thought he was a bit of a peculiar guy. He says, you might say that a rose bush has no nervous system the way we know it, right? And no throat to cry with. You would be right. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders, how do you know that a rosebud does not feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem into as you would feel when someone cuts your wrist with a garden shears? How would you know? It's alive. It has life, and therefore it is shrieking. A frightful, throatless shriek, metallic sound when the scissors are coming into contact with the stem of the yellow roses. Mrs. Saunders just runs away. From that moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. Okay, inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry. So yellow roses, and now with the daisy. And he wasn't sure now that but he wasn't so sure that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain, it was surprise. Now, one doesn't know how he's actually distinguishing between pain and surprise, right? It did not really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, that is without any emotions, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. So initially he had thought that it was a cry of pain, but now after doing the same experiment with the daisy, he felt it was a note of surprise. It was a sound of surprise, not a cry of pain. A flower probably does not feel pain. It felt something else which we do not know about. So he's not able to put his finger on what kind of emotion that really was. Something called toin or spurl or plicknuckment or anything you like. He stood and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully he picked up the black box from the table, carried it to the shed and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him and walked up to the house. Now we'll pause here in explanation video number 1. What point I want to also tell you is that, see, is he in empathy with the plant kingdom? I'm not sure, because if he was, he wouldn't be experimenting again and again with the roses, then the daisy, and then with the tree later on in the story, which we'll read about in explanation video number 2. So in that sense, he's not empathetic. He's a scientist first. He wants to prove that a sound machine can actually capture all those frightful throatless sounds. So in that sense, he's not coming across as someone very empathetic, though towards the end he feels some kind of empathy for the tree. So we are kind of getting different shades of Klausner at different points in time. The other point is coming through as a very unstable kind of person, first to the doctor to an extent, and definitely to Mrs. Saunders. So those are some of the points that you need to know about. We'll go through the rest of the chapter in explanation video number 2. Also look at some of the question and answers so that you are absolutely comfortable with this very fascinating story by the inimitable Roald Dahl. Thank you very much for watching.